Welcome to the Marvelous Middle Age Podcast, where we are building a community of people who are in the midst of midlife, sharing our stories and learning from each other along the way. Each week, I'll have a guest join me to discuss a topic that impacts our lives and touches on some aspect of midlife. We'll discuss relationships, transitions, health and well-being, parenting, careers, and more. My goal is to encourage and support you and help you thrive as you navigate this adventure of midlife. Join me here each week for the Marvelous Middle Age Podcast. This week, Kathy Good, who serves as the Senior Director of the Chris and Suzy DeWolf Family Innovation Center for Aging and Dementia, is joining me for part 4 of our conversation on caregiving. If you haven't listened to the first 3 episodes in this series, I would encourage you to go back and check those out. In this episode, Kathy and I discuss specific situations that arise in caregiving, including caring for a spouse or partner, when to bring in a professional caregiver or consider new living arrangements, driving, and more. I want to extend my deepest thanks to Kathy, who spent time with me recording these episodes. I will be forever grateful to her for sharing her personal story and expertise. Kathy Good, welcome back to the Marvelous Middle Age Podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, this is part 4 of our caregiving series, and I just want to thank you for all of the time and effort that you have put in to these episodes with me. It has been incredibly insightful for me to learn from you about caregiving and resources available and how to handle certain situations. And that's kind of what we're going to wrap up this part of the series with today, is talking specifically about specific caregiving situations, you know, people that are caring for elderly family members with other family members, or maybe you're talking with siblings about caregiving, or you're caregiving from a distance. There's a lot of different scenarios that come up when you're caregiving, and we're just going to be scratching the surface on these today. We certainly won't be doing an incredibly deep dive, but we are going to talk about them because they're most likely things that people out there are facing. They're going through it or will go through it. And so if we can start folks to kind of think about some of these things and how might they handle these situations if they come up, they're important, you know, and we all might be faced with them at some point. So again, this episode is really going to be specific to scenarios that come up in caregiving. And caregiving, from what I'm learning from a lot of people, is really a family affair. There's not usually just one care receiver and one caregiver. There may be many caregivers involved, including a spouse or partner, siblings, other extended family that are involved. And that can present some unique challenges. You know, families all have their unique dynamics and relationships. And so it can present some challenges. Also, it can be a time when people become closer in certain circumstances, but everyone may have a little different perspective on things or make their decisions differently and that kind of thing. So, you know, to kick this part of it off in terms of talking about caregiving, there are some caregivers that are caring for a spouse or a partner, and that presents some unique circumstances. You cared for your husband, Dave, for many years.
Yes.
Can you share a little bit more about that perspective, being a spouse or partner caregiver?
Well, first of all, I think that as most caregivers, you're kind of dropped into caregiving. And so the day that Dave was diagnosed with the visual variant of Alzheimer's, it's sort of like he became a person living with dementia, and basically I became his caregiver. Now, he didn't need any more care that day than he did the day before.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
Exactly.
one of the things that happens is that you have to deal with your initial shock at that kind of a diagnosis and make sure that you're not leaping into the future without enough information. Because I think that day I began thinking like, okay, he needs to go to adult day. He needs to, he needs to do, we need to bring somebody in, all this sort of thing. And it was kind of an overreaction. Sure. So when I finally grabbed myself or got control,
got your bearings a little bit.
My bearings a little bit. I went like, okay, wait a minute. He's the same guy that he was yesterday. Yes, we now know that he has something that will be progressive and terminal in nature, but he's going to live for probably at least 8 to 10 years. He lived 12 years after he was diagnosed. So, but it does change the nature of your relationship, because he and I were soulmates, always joined at the hip. And one of the things that I felt like, particularly as his condition progressed, was I lost having his head in the ball game. Because one of the things that I thought was really awesome when we got married was that we were able to have two of us thinking about problem solving and figuring out what it was that we needed to do in our lives. And as his condition progressed, of course, I couldn't rely on him any longer in the same kind of way. Could I ask him? Could I tell him things? Yes. But he was not able, obviously, as anybody might assume, to be able to sort of be an equal in problem solving or figuring out what we wanted to do with our lives. Certainly he could still respond. He always was really active and going. In fact, sometimes I was still working at the time, and I'd get home and he'd go like, okay, where are we going? I'm going like, well, I was thinking we'd stay home.
Right. So I'm exhausted.
So some things about Dave did not change at all, but it changed the nature of our ability to problem solve together. And it clearly changes the nature of your relationship, because I was still his wife, but we always had prided ourselves on the fact that we were kind of equals in so many ways. And so no longer were we kind of the same sort of set of equals. And so it meant that I had to sort of figure out how to live my life sort of apart from him. Clearly staying together because I loved him. Of course. He was my spouse, but figuring out like making my own path. And that was really challenging, because trying to figure out, so how was I going to keep myself in good shape, because we both needed us, or both needed me. How was I going to figure out like what we needed to do that would be good for both of us? So it was a different kind of relationship that started, and then probably the further he progressed, the further that we became in terms of not so much coupled, but functioning independently.
Yeah. You know, you touched on so many great points there. I think the shift in the nature of the relationship is a big one. You know, like you said, you go from being this, you know, dynamic duo, partners, soulmates, doing things together, going out, all your activities, you know, entertaining or seeing friends or traveling, and then things start to shift.
Yes.
And there's some grief that comes with that. But along with that, you mentioned really needing then to figure out a different path or a new path for yourself, in addition to obviously staying married to him and caring for him and being with him as his spouse, but also figuring out, okay, how do I care for myself well right now so that I can be the caregiver I need to be for him? But then also, how do I have things of my own that I continue to enjoy if he isn't able or whatnot? So it's this very fluid kind of dynamic thing that happens in the relationship. I think too, there's probably for some folks out there listening, it might get to be a point, and I don't know if that you ran into this, but where the care just becomes a lot to manage on your own, where you realize I need help. I need, you know, there's someone to come into the home to help me, or we need to relocate where we can get more support, or whatever the case may be. And that's a big shift too, I think, in a relationship, a partnership, a marriage, where it's the two of you, you're in your home and things are going, and then somebody else has to come into the picture to help support. And I'm sure, you know, you experienced some level of that in all this. And how did that kind of change things for you?
It's really interesting, because many of the activities of daily living that people, as their condition progress, need are things that seem simple enough. You know, help with dressing, help with bathing, help with eating, all this sort of thing. And so I think it's easy to not then think about, do I need help for somebody else to do that? And probably what really made me the most aware of how much I had been doing and recognizing that I couldn't continue it was when Dave wrenched his back and went for rehab. And in his absence was when I could really see, oh my goodness sakes, all that I had been doing, because it's incremental. You start and then you just add a little more and a little more. And was this time when Dave had really funky toenails, and I was having trouble getting his socks on, and we were under a deadline because I had to get him to milestones and I had to get to work, and I kind of lost it. Okay. Now that losing it and having to go out in the hallway and go like and breathe and come back in and say
deep breathing.
Okay, I'm sorry, Dave. And then he's saying, I'm sorry. I go like, no, you don't have to be sorry. It's me. But I should have recognized that should have been a clue to me that I was needed.
You needed help. Yeah.
But in his absence, then I could see all of that and then realize that we had to do something different.
Yeah. And that's, again, another shift. And so I would encourage folks out there who are in this situation at the moment, give yourself a lot of grace, be patient with yourself, but also, you had that opportunity when he was away to really take stock and say, wow, I didn't realize this was where I was at. I know I need support here. And that's a big decision to make, but so necessary.
Yes,
so necessary.
It was really interesting because I had hired some people to come in and provide companionship care for him because I knew that he shouldn't be alone. But it never occurred to me, even though I'm a social worker, I sort of like should have been more aware that what I also needed was for someone to help do some of these things that they could do with him, and that I was really frustrated and overwhelmed about. So it's more than just companionship. It was actually somebody could have come in twice a week and helped him bathe, or I could have had them in the morning to help him get dressed so that I could also be getting dressed and getting ready for work. So it's hard to have that awareness. I think one of the things about having our Family Caregiver Center is we do have people there that you can talk to that might help you get a better clue than what I had at the time.
Let me just tell you, Well, and to your point, you had the social work background. You had every, tidbit of knowledge of, gosh, if you were counseling someone not in your family, but someone else, you would have probably told them, hey, you need to bring in someone. And here you are, so I want, again, listeners to know that, again, you've got to give yourself a lot of grace here, because this isn't easy and it's something you don't always recognize right off of the get-go.
Exactly.
Another situation that I know people that are in this situation right now that are caregiving for usually parents, older parents with their siblings. And a sibling relationship in caregiving can be interesting. There can be feelings of one sibling doing maybe more than another, or based on family history and relationships, there can be some dynamics there going on. People make decisions differently. So if you've got multiple siblings that you're talking to about care for dad, that can get real complicated real quick. And especially if people, and we'll talk more about long distance caregiving too, but if not everyone lives close by in the same community, that even puts a whole nother spin on things. So I think with sibling caregiving, I think we were kind of just talking a little before we started recording about a situation. And I think the more you can be proactive about these kind of things and say, hey, I know I can see dad's really struggling with this, or this is happening. I'm seeing this, especially if there's a sibling that maybe lives near the care receiver and maybe someone else doesn't, and they're not seeing this person on a daily basis and noticing some things. So having those conversations, I think, is early in the process, even before you might even think the care receiver needs care. They might be just completely independent and fine and all of the things, but you're like, we should really talk to dad about what he would like, what his wishes might be if, this happens. And it's just, I talked to someone the other day who's caring for her mom with her her sister, and they fortunately have a great relationship. They've got a great process of how they handle things and have access to documents and all kinds of things, but it's still something that, for better or for worse, those are your siblings. They also have thoughts about all this too. And it's just a whole different kind of challenging situation, or it could be also something that brings people closer together too. So that's another scenario that people need to navigate in caregiving. Another situation, I mentioned it briefly, is long distance.
Yes.
And that, can be really, really tough. If your care receiver lives in another city or state, caregiving can just be so much more difficult. Your time, your financial resources can become an issue in terms of being able to take time away to visit the person, the financial implications of that. You may have to, depend on others to keep an eye on your care receiver. If you're listening to this and you're not in Eastern Iowa and you're like, wow, this is me, the Innovation Center has resources and programs. Call in. And again, I'll put a link in the show notes to the website with all the contact information, but reach out and say, gosh, my mom lives here. I'm here. What are some things you would recommend? Do you have any thoughts, Kathy, or recommendations for people who might not live in the same city or state as their care receiver? Anything that you would suggest to them that they consider in all this?
Well, one of the resources that I'm hoping that you'll put in so that caregivers can see is a handbook for long-distance caregivers that comes from the Family Caregiver Alliance. And when I reviewed it, I think it's really good.
Great.
So that's kind of the primer about what you could do and what not to do and what's helpful. But I think that if you are an only long distance caregiver, and maybe you're the only caregiver, then I think that it would be good for you to just sort of in preparation to think about what might my parent need, is to think about on a day-to-day basis, what are all the things that you take care of?
Okay. Oh, wow.
So if you think about, or you get up in the morning and you got to fix food, right? You have to have breakfast. And there's a whole food thing. So then maybe it is that you have to run errands. Well, let's see, you have to pick up your drugs at the drugstore. You have to pick up your dry clean. So you think about all of the things that people need on a regular basis to sort of sustain themselves. And then maybe you go to the bank and you deal with your finances. And then maybe you decide that there's some sort of legal question you have. So you go through. One of the things I think could be helpful is just to think about what are all the things I'm dealing with. And then those are all the things that my parent or the person who might need some long distance caregiving needs. And then figure out what do I have the resources to meet their needs in those areas, and which ones do I need to sort of figure out who else could do it.
Right. Outsourcing it a little bit.
And then I think it's also to sort of talk with the person that lives long distance from you and say, I've been thinking about today, these are all of the things that I sort of needed to take care of. How are you taking care of those? And just enter into a conversation that isn't like, oh my God, I realize you're old and you can't possibly be doing these things. But
not the best way to bring that up,
you
right?
Really
but you can
engage in a conversation that includes what I've been thinking about, and if as I age, I'm wondering who's going to do these and how are these going for you, so that you begin the conversation. Okay.
Yep.
Then if you happen to have siblings, I also think, and if you get in that long distance caregiving role and they don't seem as involved, I would start making a list of all of the things that I've been doing that mom needs or dad needs, so that then you could say, because sometimes somebody can't get in their head, well, what could you possibly
what
be
are you doing?
doing?
I don't,
So I think that when you write things down somehow, and whether you do that in a computer or you do that on a piece of paper, but that becomes then fodder for sharing with a sibling to say, and I can't sustain myself doing all of these. Are there any of these things that you could do? So then you're talking specifically, instead of just like saying, I need help, and they're going like, well, I don't know.
They may not even know
they may not
what
even
you need
understand.
help with or what needs to be done.
So specificity, I think, can be an important aspect of that. And I'm not saying that makes it all go smoothly.
No,
because somebody may still be resistive to helping or think that they don't know how or whatever.
For
but
sure.
I think it is an easier conversation.
Absolutely. Well, and I think to your point, I think sometimes people don't really know what is all going into this and what the challenges are. And if you can document it somehow and say, here are all the things, right, that either you've been doing or you anticipate needing help with, let's create a little division of labor here so that one of us isn't doing it all, and that we can, it will help. Again, like you said, not that it makes it easy or perfect, but that it at least helps things to flow a little more smoothly, and that each person knows what the other one is up to, so that if there is an issue, you can say, oh, Jane is the one who is handling the finances. Let's have her research this or whatever, or something of that nature. Especially, I think, when there's maybe one sibling who does live near the person and then there are other siblings that don't. I think that's where that can really, I know in a past life, I used to teach a class about caregiving, and there were people who did live near the care receiver, and then they had siblings that didn't. And sometimes some feelings of resentment could build pretty easily. And so trying to be proactive in that so that doesn't happen is a great goal to have. And the more you can have these conversations and really, talk about these things openly and honestly, because there might be family members who are caregiving that they may, I don't want to say denial, but they may not be seeing this person as much as you are. And they might be in a little bit of denial around what's really going on. Oh yeah, mom's just forgetful. She's fine, or some other issue. Right. And so it's just, you have to, again, not that you want to be the bearer of bad tidings, but you have to say, no, this is really what's going on with mom, and we need to have a conversation about that.
Right.
So,
I always used to tell my clients that resentment is a clue that you're giving more than you've got to give. And so
I love that.
So it's good to pay attention to when you're feeling resentful, because that probably is another clue that you need to talk with your siblings or get some other help.
Right. I love that. Take that, everybody, and sock that one away, because I could totally see how that could absolutely be a clue, a big clue. So driving. We were talking about driving a little bit. I feel like driving is one of the first things that can become a concern for families. The ability to safely operate a vehicle, balanced with that individual's autonomy and independence, and driving just is one of those really tough conversations. Now, sometimes that conversation is decided for you because someone maybe isn't able to get their license. They go in to get a renewal and they're not able to get it.
Right.
And then you are faced with, okay, what are we going to do? What resources are available? How can we support this individual because they're not legally able to drive? But sometimes you start to notice things. I know someone who was noticing some things about his mother's driving, and she had come to visit and driven to see him, and he had noticed some things and said, Mom, hey, I need to run an errand real quick. Can you drive me? And he just sat in the passenger seat and observed and was like, yeah, this is a problem. We need to start having conversations. And so, not that I'm saying everyone should do that, but I think, if you're not sure, if you don't know, try to get some input from other people in the family or whatnot. But driving is just a tough thing because it is such a huge part of independence and being able to do things for yourself. So.
Right. Sometimes I think that if you are caregiving to somebody who's older, what you know is that as they age, even if they don't have some sort of thing like dementia, they may get to the point where they're just really not safe driving.
Yeah.
And so if you can be proactive, one of the things that I think that you could do is to engage in a conversation and to say, I've been thinking about what would we do if you get to the point where you can't drive. Not saying that that's now, but what would we do? And so I wonder if we start thinking about, like, let's see, every Monday I go get groceries. Wonder if I picked you up and you went with me and you got your groceries at that time. I wonder how that would be. Let's try that out sometime. Maybe we could combine that with lunch. I mean, so that you start thinking about, or you say, I've been looking at and thinking, like, what public transportation is available, or is there an Uber available? Or if you live in our area, there's, and especially in the Cedar Rapids area, there's something called Riders Club.
Yeah.
And so that you start exploring resources before you ever need them.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that it will be easy to have a conversation that says, I think we're there. But, and it's something that you, again, join in with and work with somebody so that it's not like all of a sudden you're in a crisis and they can't drive and you're having to say that. Although I think that sometimes the DOT will say that because they won't renew your license. Right. I think that sometimes somebody's doctor can be the bearer of the bad news, that says because of blah and blah and blah, you need those skills or those abilities to be able to drive, and you don't have them anymore. And so I'm going to suggest that you not drive anymore.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, and your point about having these conversations early is so important. And I really can't stress that enough. I think sometimes we wait till the crisis comes, or we don't want to talk about it. It's just so hard to talk about. And I think the sooner you can have the conversation, the more you can be creative in solution making, and you can involve the person receiving care in the solution so that they really feel a part of the decision-making process, whatever it is, whether it's driving or living arrangements or something financial or whatever. I just can't stress that enough. It's so important to have those conversations early when the individual can have the conversation and share their input. I know there might be some of you out there listening where that ship has sailed and that is impossible anymore. Right. But for those of you that do have that gift of time still, please take advantage of it, because that is, it is a gift to have that opportunity, and hopefully will make that decision-making process a little easier for everyone involved. Another scenario that happens frequently with caregiving is where you live. It's a big decision, whether it's just the care receiver's living arrangements, or maybe it's the caregiver and the care receiver together because they're partners or spouses. It's a big deal. And you made that decision for you and for Dave. Kind of what factors were involved in that decision for you when you were deciding living arrangements?
Well, I think that when Dave injured his back and went for rehab, and I started thinking about all of the things that I was doing and how many times I was out in the hallway breathing because I'd sort of lost it. That was one of the indicators. And so the other thing is that I probably wasn't sleeping and because of the needs that Dave had. And so sometimes for caregivers, that's one of the things to think about, because if you can't sleep because for whatever reason the person that you're caring for, their needs disturb your sleep, whether that's because they need something in the night, or you're just so stressed you can't sleep. A lack of sleep affects everything. So that's one that can be an indicator. Another indicator, and I should have seen this sooner, had to do with Dave's incontinence. And so incontinence that you really can't stay ahead of, or that is really difficult to manage, is also maybe another reason that person at least needs a higher level of care than you can provide at home. Doesn't mean you can't bring in more help if you're so inclined, but oftentimes that means that you may need to look for a different kind of housing. Right. And if you're a couple and growing older, I think it has to do with how are you handling all of the maintenance in your house, and can you find the people that you need to do what it is that needs done, and then can you afford to pay for them? Right. Because sometimes it becomes less expensive to move to some sort of other housing arrangement where you don't have all of that maintenance. You're not always looking for somebody to repair it. Or sometimes the house that you're living in is not constructed. It's got steps, and the only bathroom is upstairs. And so you increase your fall risk, or maybe your mobility is such that it's even difficult to get up and down those steps.
You bet.
So there are a lot of factors that go in. I don't think that's an easy decision.
No.
At all, to decide to leave where you've been, because most people want to age in place.
Yes.
And you can bring in help, but it's you also then have to manage the help.
Right. You have to manage that. Yeah. And unless you have someone there 24/7, some amount of that care will still fall on your shoulders, which maybe for some people, they're like, yeah, I can handle this much, but not everything. And that's fine. But the in-home scenarios present their own challenges as well. Yes. And so it is a big decision. You're absolutely right. And there are a lot of factors that go into it. And again, this is a situation where I would encourage people to reach out to the Family Innovation Center and walk through this with someone who has had this experience, who knows. They can maybe say, yeah, it really does sound like you're at this point where you may need to consider living somewhere else. Here are some recommendations we have, or here are some factors you want to kind of think through, or, hey, can we help you, identify some places and that you can look at, or get a tour or whatever, right? The situation is, because it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And you're right. Most people want to age in place, and that's their first kind of thing where they dig their heels in a little bit. And again, like driving, to me, this is just another conversation that if you can have it early, if you can have it early on, and again, like you said with the driving, not that we're there, but hey, gosh, I know you had your hip replaced a few months ago, and those stairs seem to be giving you some trouble. Can we talk about how we might maybe reconfigure where your bedroom is in the home, if that's an option? Or, hey, have you thought about maybe getting an apartment over there at such and such facility? I hear they have a great setup over there. Maybe we should take a tour, or, whatever the case may be. But again, those conversations that, again, tough to have. I'm not saying it's not hard, but the earlier on you can have it, the better.
Absolutely.
Last but definitely not least, and again, we're really just barely scraping the surface on any of these issues, but is really talking about the loss and the grief that comes with caregiving. Certainly there's end-of-life issues that are a part of this whole process. And again, we certainly will not address all of those completely here, but I do want to acknowledge it as part of the caregiving process and the experience that people are having, and to acknowledge that it's okay to feel sad, to feel some loss in all of this. You can experience it during, after, at any point. And I would just really encourage people to reach out to, whether it's a professional, therapist, family, friends that you trust, maybe it's clergy at your church, wherever. Talk to people who have been through this. Join one of the groups out at the Family Innovation Center. Speak with people you feel comfortable sharing with, because this is a part of the process. It's a part of the experience, and those feelings are important and need to be communicated and shared and processed through, because if you just tuck them away and don't acknowledge them, it can be, harmful to your mental health, and you certainly don't want to do that. So I know personally you've been through all of this, but I know it's professionally you're calling now. And so I don't know if you have anything to share about this, Kathy.
One of the things that I would just mention in terms of loss, after somebody is diagnosed and before they die, and that is a concept by Pauline Boss called ambiguous loss. And ambiguous loss is how a person is here but not here in the same way that they used to be. So in Dave's case, he was certainly here physically, but he was not here cognitively in the same way that he'd always been. And so what she said is, what I was fortunate enough to be able to spend a couple of hours with Pauline Boss. She lives in Minnesota and Minneapolis. but in her books, and what they say is that the way that you manage that is that you grieve the losses, and I used to call them gut punches.
Yeah, that's a good descriptor.
That's sort of like, oh, now Dave can't do this. So it was another thing that he used to be able to do, or we could do together, and now it wasn't possible. And so you want to acknowledge it. You want to sort of cry about it, talk about it, not bury it. Okay.
Right.
So somehow make sure that you deal with it somehow openly, but at the same time that you're mourning your losses, you also want to focus on what you still have.
Yes.
And so there were a lot of things that I still have with Dave, and we had together. And so when I was visiting with her, she had me make a list of the losses, the things that had been the gut punches. And then she said, okay, now I want you to make a list of what are all the things that you still have. You can still hold his hand. You can still have a kiss. You'll still sleep together. All these things that I still had that are easy to forget when you're buried in the losses that you're experiencing. So that was a valuable concept. And at the Family Caregiver Center, we're connected with a group in Arizona called Duet. And they have a series which we offer, in which Pauline Boss talks about her concept. And then locally, then we have, after the participants have watched the video, we have a discussion here. So we think I think it's now I can't remember, 8 or 10 weeks.
Okay.
And it's facilitated here. And so that's been very helpful, I think, to a lot of caregivers to just sort of remember how to acknowledge loss, but not get stuck there.
Right.
And also focus on the things they still have.
Absolutely. That was just beautifully said when you were talking about being able to focus on the loss in terms of processing through that, acknowledging it, not pretending it's not happening, right? It's happening. So you want to acknowledge it, but then also remembering all the things you do still have, and the joy that you can still have with that person and with this situation. So that's really important. And for some people listening, they might be sitting there going, gosh, I can't think of anything. Well, I bet if you really did or talked to someone about it, you probably could think of some things. And again, will things ever be the way they were? No. But you can find new ways to experience life with your care receiver, whether it's a spouse or partner, a parent, another family member. And it's just a different way of living with that person. Yes. And, when we were talking at the beginning of the episode, you talked about the day that Dave was diagnosed, that he was the same Dave that day that he was the day before, right? Now, again, I know his health changed over time, but he was still your spouse, still your husband. And, there are still joys and happy things about your relationship, even probably towards the end when it was the hardest. And so I think we just have to remember that. I think about my mom when she was ill, and there were a lot of hard things. Her health, declined, but there were still so many beautiful things about our relationship all the way up until the day that she died. Right. And so it is there. Sometimes, some days it's a little harder to remember, but you have to do that. And it's so important. And again, reaching out for assistance professionally, with family, with friends, whatever the case may be, is so important. You don't need to go it alone, right? Because there are other people going through it. And I will link to Pauline's work, so people can access those resources if they would so choose to do that. I know we just barely touched on a lot of these scenarios, but I would have felt remiss if I didn't bring some of these up in this series, because they're reality. They're things that people are going through in caregiving. And I just appreciate you being so honest and transparent and vulnerable and open with your personal caregiving situation, but also just such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to what the center has to offer, and just generally about caregiving and situations and ways to make good decisions and process this and go through this experience. So again, Kathy, I just want to thank you so much.
Well, you're
It's been so much fun.
I've enjoyed it a lot, and it's been my pleasure to be a part of your podcast. And I sort of really want to point out how the fact that you're doing it is awesome. So
Thank you.
To have a podcast that's focused on caregiving and understanding yourself, what's involved, but then allowing for all of this information to go out to all your listeners, I really applaud you.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It's, again, something that has just been such a important thing to me, again, professionally and then personally. And I feel it's important. I feel like it's a conversation that needs to be had more and normalized more, that there are a lot of us that are going through it and will go through it in the future. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you're enjoying the podcast, please follow the show to make sure the latest episode is on your podcast feed each week. I would greatly appreciate a rating and a 5-star review on the podcast platform you're listening on. It helps others to find the show. If there are topics you'd like me to discuss on the show, please email me at themarvelousmiddleagepodcast@gmail.com or direct message me on Instagram at Nicole Stute. Thank you for listening.